So thank you everybody for joining. Those of you online, sorry you don't get to partake in these great cookies that Lynn brought us. There we go. But thank you for coming today. We'll do introductions here in just a second, but just to give you an overview of our agenda, wanted to give an update on lake conditions, update on the Berm protocol, the HB 513 rules. I do want to reserve, make sure we are able to spend some time talking about the Berm modifications and what should we do coming up this winter. We need to get that conversation going. And then Laura Vernon should be here soon and be able to walk through, kind of give you an update on the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan and where that stands. So why don't we just quick go around the room here and have introductions. I'm Jeff Denblaker with Jacobs Engineering, facilitating.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
Ryan Rowland, U.S. Geological Survey.
Andy Carlson, USGS.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Andrew Ruppke, Utah Geological Survey.
Jesse Compass Minerals.
Ben Stireman, Forestry Fair and Stevens.
Mark Reynolds, U.S. MAG.
Elliot Jagnecki, UGS.
Seth Majors, Department of Natural Resources.
Ryan Doherty, Cargill Salt.
Bill Brown, Ryan Trump Cooperative.
Great. And then online, I see John Luft with Wildlife Resources, Craig Miller with Water Resources. I see Bonnie Baxter's picture there. List. Morning, Bonnie, with Westminster University. Rob Dubuque with Friends of Great Salt Lake. I think that's everybody. All right. Super. Well, just in terms of the agenda, anything else want to make sure we talk about today? Or hi, Jim Harris just walked in. Hi, Jim. Hey. All right. Well, let's proceed. Christine, Ryan, if you guys want to give us an update on lake conditions.
Sure. Andy and I are going to be giving an update on conditions. So let me figure out how to share.
While you're pulling that up, thank you all that participated in that Berm tour. I guess it's been a couple weeks now. I think that was really helpful. There were a lot of people that reached out afterwards and had never been out there and really enjoyed the presentation from USGS and just a lot of good info. So thanks again.
My driver helped me.
Oh yeah, I guess I'll go first. Sure. Okay, just going through the update on lake surface elevation. I think we've hit the low for the year. It's pretty much leveled off. Spring highs 4194, 6 feet higher than last year, give or take. And 4192 is the daily value from just a few days ago. It's down about 1.8 feet since the high. North Arm has pretty much stayed pretty consistent throughout the whole year. So good job, Berm. There's a 3-foot difference currently between the elevation in the South Arm and the North Arm. And the major inflows, you'd see yeah, I didn't know I was doing this.
Oh, okay. All right. So we see these plots before. This is a cumulative stream flow in million feet. It's a log scale on the y-axis. We're showing a water year on the x-axis. The bold black line is data for this new water year. And what's important right now is we're in the green zone, which is the 25th to 75th percentile based on the historic data. And we're actually just a tad above the little gray line in the green zone, which is the median value. So, you know, hey, we'll right? We're tracking along like maybe we have there historically. We hit the next button. Here's the Weaver River near Plain City, exact same type of plot. The bold black line is just above the 75th percentile for this time of year. We're almost outside that green zone. So good place to be for Plain City. Next is the Goggin Drain. Bold black line again, it's pushing the 75th percentile relative to the historic data. So we'll take it off to a decent start. Next. Farmington Bay outflow. The bold black line again, it's tracking the median. There's a relatively shorter period of record at this site, but that's where we are right now. It's, of course, we're real early in the water year, but let's all just have a good relaxing weekend since there's snow on the hills right now. So yeah, that's it for the major surface water inflows.
And these are the discharge measurement made at the breach since July of 2021. We're generally showing 0 north to south flow since the berm was raised. And I want to zoom in on these right here and some of the efforts that we're making to build a stage discharge relationship at the breach. You can see there's an obvious relationship once the major incision that happened at the berm occurred in late July. And this is what it looks like in a semi-log plot, the relationship between those 5 measurements since then. And this is the relationship with all the measurements there. So you'd see it's terrible normally, but pretty good right now with a small data set. And this is the discharge time series based on that relationship. And the average departure from the rating is about 3%.
So those major discharge values.
Mhm.
Part of it.
This is the ADVM that has been out there since I started doing this for sure. You can see how it tracks nicely the velocity values with the lake surface elevation. And I wanted to point out the jump in velocity on June 11th when the major incision in the berm occurred. And if you've ever wondered what 25 bends of velocity data crammed into 17 feet of water looks like, it looks like that. This is the new ADVM that we've installed out there. It's collecting a much higher resolution velocity record throughout the water column. And this is just recreating the earlier ADVM to show how well it tracks with how the old ADVM measured velocity and lake surface elevation. And am I doing this? Are you doing this?
I'll do this.
Okay.
So this is what our crew kind of came up with in terms of surveying the berm. We just wanted to quickly share this with everybody. So they've done drone surveys as well as RTK surveys. I've done 3 of them now, and this is data from the survey from August 28th. And so this is basically looking at the berm, which we all visited a few weeks ago, and then using the photogrammetry, so the drone imagery with the RTK data. Actually, I think this is just the drone imagery, coming up with relative profile of what that berm looks like. So it's eroded about 3 feet from where it was constructed at 4192. So just wanted to make everyone aware of this and the fact that we've shared this, like these relative differences, to give you a sense for kind of decision-making purposes. And the error, the uncertainty associated with those initial surveys was not within what our technicians were comfortable with. So they've redone the surveys multiple times. It's now within an error, I think, in the Z direction of 0 to 3 centimeters, which is allowing them to kind of put these relative differences in absolute space. And that will be useful for modeling for SOM, for Division of Water Resources, as they really try to use this shape to then model discharge through the area. So they're working on kind of crunching these numbers and hoping to get kind of more final results to you very soon.
So Christine, can I ask a question? So based on that preliminary data then, it's eroded in the middle, almost 3 feet from 4192?
That's correct. And then I also just wanted to throw in a plug that Casey Root in our office has used LiDAR data that was flown by the state in 2016 and merged that with our bathymetric data that was done in 2005, 2006. So we have an updated Great Salt Lake topo bathymetry data set for North Arm, South Arm, and the 2 bays. I just wanted to make people aware of that. It's publicly available. And this is what we used in the salt mass balance study that we've shared results on. But just wanted to make sure you all know that that's out and available. So quick update on the salinity. I actually want to start here. So with our most recent measurements conducted by GSLEP on October 5th, our most recent measurements are around 144, 143 grams per liter. And as Andy alluded to, we're kind of at our seasonal low. We think the lake has stabilized. So I would guess that salinity is not going to increase anymore past this. I think this is kind of where we might be for this year. Relative to last fall, 3510 and 2565 were down about 41 to 43 grams per liter relative to last fall. So certainly more dilute. And we are still seeing some spatial heterogeneity. So seeing consistent measurements in Gilbert Bay and 2565 and really at our site in Farmington Bay, but we do see more dilute salinities at 2267. Where the Bear River comes in, those are around 127 grams per liter at the moment. Just putting these most recent measurements in the context of other data as well as our historic record, you can see we're kind of more in that optimal range where we want to be around 144. And these results are also sort of supported by recent measurements at the breach, 142 grams per liter on October 13th. In Saltaire, October 10th, 143. UGS did a bunch of measurements recently on October 17th. Those range from 140 to 144 grams per liter. And our crew is actually out there this week. They're going to have to wait a little while for the weather, but they were actually out 2 days ago, got a measurement from 3510, and that was 142 grams per liter. So that's really our most up-to-date measurement of salinity. Do you want me to go into the forecast now, Jeff, or wait?
No, let's hold on that.
Okay.
Any questions on? Thanks, Christine.
Yeah.
Who has their hand up? Bill.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Christine, can you send out that link for the topo bathymetry? I couldn't find it just Googling around. It all goes back to Rob Baskin's 2006 data. So it would be easier if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yep, I'll do that.
Great. Anybody else? Yeah, Joe.
What format are the data in? The bathymetry?
It's actually a series of tables, and I think Casey also has a raster, but it's basically elevation, surface area, volume tables you can look up for each of the different bays and all together as a whole.
Great. For anything else? All right. Well, thank you. Conditions are certainly where we wanted them to be. Oh, you took that. Okay. All right. Well, Ben, could you give us an update on Berm protocol and HB 15 or
Yeah.
13? I'm sorry.
Absolutely. So as far as the Berm protocol goes, we still haven't officially adopted the old protocol because I think the protocol didn't really take into account the nature's impact on the berm. And so as Ryan USGS just described, there's really, we could potentially flatten it out, but I don't think there's a huge bang for our buck in that. Water's flowing through right now. So I think the big question, which we'll discuss later, is, potentially how we might raise that. But I'd like to suggest that while we're doing that, rather than just focus on, how much we raise it this year, that perhaps we start diving into like what that long-term protocol looks like. And I think understanding that there might be shifts in what happens during, the flows, that might be something we'd like to account for, and having some flexibility in when we monitor, based on seasonality. I think those are some of the things that were maybe lacking in the old protocol. And so, yeah, I think that's really the only update I have. But I think it's apparent this year with water still spilling over the breach, we're still slightly above 4192, that if we were to simply just reconstruct the berm, we may not have the impact we would want. capturing, fresh water and impounding it. And I think maybe you can touch on some of the observations about what came in the Bear River, the Weber River, and kind of skirt along the causeway and came out. Like if we've solidified any of that information, I think Bill had been
Yeah.
working a little bit on that with you. So maybe
Yeah.
that's part of the conversation. But I do think that we need to, have that consideration as we're talking about where the most bang for our buck goes on potentially raising it or lowering it or leaving it where it's at. So, but we can do that when we get into the.
Sure. We can do it now if
Discussion
you'd
of the
like,
berm.
but, or we,
Yeah, I think we're gonna talk more about the future of the berm later, right?
Yeah.
So let's maybe just hold that for then. And then am I up on 513?
Yeah.
Okay. That was a quick update on the berm because there's not a whole lot to update other than what you all already did. So HB 513, you're all familiar. That was a law that was passed mainly in relation to extraction on the lake. So I know our mineral representatives are familiar with 513, and we've had a lot of discussions with extraction industry on, what this might look like. But we were finally able to get a draft of our proposed rules out a couple weeks ago. And this is actually done right now in the informal rulemaking process. So this isn't a part of the process that's required out of our division. But we know that these are contentious and that they could have a big impact on the economy and on the lake's vitality. And so we thought that it'd be prudent for us to put them out there and make sure that we gather as many comments as we can and hopefully, find the best way to move forward. And so in doing that, we asked for comments from stakeholders to be submitted by the 31st of this month. This won't be the last chance to engage. We do intend to try to incorporate stakeholder comments as much as we can, and then have another public meeting after that where not only stakeholders, but the general public can come and hear, how we plan to roll out the rules. And then we also will, once we get it to that point, which again, we haven't even entered into the administrative rule writing process or rulemaking process. At that point, it goes up to the Division of Administrative Rules and then goes through that full process. So there's another chance for if anybody was really upset with the way things turned out, they could still make their case there. But hopefully we've mitigated a lot of that ahead of time. I think that one of the advantages that I would say is that right now we have the opportunity to discuss the differences that we may have on where these rules are at and try to get them to a good spot. But once it goes up to the Division of Administrative Rules, if it gets a certain amount of appeals, then it has to go through a full process. And a lot of that discussion, ends up kind of with a different, so we'd like to handle this as much as we can here at DNR and get them into a good spot that folks feel comfortable with. And we do recognize the draft rules are a starting point for discussions. They're not the end point. We had to put something on paper, and we feel like we did a pretty good job, but there's obviously going to be room to improve and understand processes and get stakeholder feedback. So please don't hesitate to make comments. But what I would say is the comments that we're seeking right now, we're hoping that there's not just like, we don't like this. We'd really like people to say, we don't like this. Here's why, and here's our suggestion to improve this. So we're really looking for that constructive feedback, so we know, what the desire is, and then potentially how we might improve those rules. But I did want to just touch a little bit on like the structure of the rules. I don't know how much time you all have spent in HB 513, but it was one of the more complicated bills that I've had to ever be involved in rulemaking on. And so it took a really long time for us to even just kind of map out what these rules look like. And then also, really dial in how our rules would capture the intent of the bill. And so there's a few different components of it. Again, one of the main objectives of the rule was to create a process for not only for lithium, but for any new mineral that is getting extracted on the lake. So, this will be effective for anything else that becomes marketable. And so the way that we're looking at this is, we took 513 as a do no harm to the lake while we're extracting minerals. So if folks can do what they're doing and say they can do what they can do and actually do it, then it should be no problem, because there's a lot of promises and things that have been said that would implicate not depleting any water, or like in Compass's case, it's a part of their existing process and they're just taking one more mineral. And so what we'd really like to do, and same with US Magnesium, what we would really like to do with these rules is understand exactly what impacts might happen, like exactly how much water is being depleted. And HB 513 has a lot of nuances about, historic depletions of water, any impacts to the biota of the lake. So the way that we accomplish that is we have several stages of the application process, and this will apply to everybody, not just new companies on the lake, but all companies will have to demonstrate they're not harming the lake and demonstrate their process and their commercial viability. And so the way that this would work is we would accept an application just to get your foot in the door and say, we'd like to do this feasibility process or project. And they would come and say, here's how we think this looks. This is what what we're aiming to recover. This is how we're going to do it. Here's the chemistry of the water coming in. And in some cases, there may be water being discharged. Here's the chemistry coming out. Here are the impacts or lack of impacts we think will happen. So we can take that initial application and say, yes, we agree. The information that's been submitted, we don't believe there's any impacts. So you can move on to your actual feasibility project, or what you might refer to as a pilot project. And then you can go out, do your pilot project, and demonstrate that what you said you could do is factual and it actually is that way. And if there's minor variances, I think we can deal with those as long as there are no negative impacts to the biota. Once that's been proved, they have to get a certification from our division and from the Division of Water Quality. I know they're working on their potential rules right now and working through some of those processes. So maybe Jim can speak to that. But essentially, this allows a lot of I guess protocols and procedures to ensure that we know exactly what's going to happen before we get to the point of entering into like an operational agreement or issuing a royalty agreement. So this gives us the ability to really understand what's happening to the lake, what's being withdrawn. If that process adheres to what was lined out in HB 513. And so at that point, we would give royalty agreements, and then there would be additional monitoring throughout the time that anybody's operational on the lake. And I think another really important aspect is we do have a provision in here that would require all operators that are extracting lithium to enter into a cooperative agreement on how operations would work. And if we start to see like cumulative impacts on the lake, if we start to see degradation, like for example, calcium being deposited on microbialites, or just something that we can't, maybe it's not measurable at the discharge, but we want to be cognizant of what's going on. If we start to see those cumulative impacts, there would be this cooperative agreement among the extractors that would say how they would deal with that. So, how we would maybe scale back production at the time until we can figure out a resolution to that or whatnot. I think that's going to create more collaboration and more opportunity for extractors to partner and do good work on the lake and make sure that we're not degrading the lake. So that was done based on the fact that this is a common resource, common supply. We know that this is not, the lake. It's suspended in the brine, so it doesn't stay in one company's footprint. So that's part of the reason for that. But we also want to recognize the fact that there is connection in the waters and how that works there. Another really important part of HB 513 was establishing an emergency trigger for Great Salt Lake. And this has less to do with lithium extraction and more just to do with the conditions of the lake. It was based on salinity, so we didn't have the tools to say at a certain lake level this happens, but at a certain salinity, we had to earmark that. And I thought this committee would be a really good place, and I apologize. I probably could have brought this discussion forward sooner, but basically the salinity committee will make a recommendation to the state on when that trigger has been reached. And we set those thresholds at 90 grams per liter on the low end and 150 grams per liter on the high end. And I want to make sure that you all understand what this means. It doesn't mean that extraction is shut off. It doesn't mean that that's even the next step. It just means that it opens the door to the suite of options that 513 allowed. So one of those options was like going in and being able to build another berm or a structure like that. I think it also triggers that point of being able to start to have discussions with extractors who have a force majeure provision in their lease. And I want to make sure I explain what our interpretation of force majeure is. And it doesn't mean that we go in and say, company A, B, or C, you're shutting down. It's more where we start to have those discussions about, our mutual obligations. We have an obligation under those contracts, and so do these companies. So it kind of gives that opening point to relieve each other of those obligations and say maybe like, hey, if you want to take a break this year, we could agree that you wouldn't lose your release that's held in production or something along those lines. Or if you can scale back, like we can start to have those discussions and negotiations. So we're not trying to be heavy-handed by having these in there. This just simply says, when we get in this range, we ought to be a little bit worried, if we start to fall outside of that range. So it's something we should be concerned about. And I think this group is really well poised to be able to, start to kind of hone in on what that means. We can, I think a lot of these discussions might happen right here at this table about like what actions we could take to improve those conditions, and just like we already are doing. But yeah, that's really the kind of the 30,000 foot view or the overview of these rules. If anybody has questions or wants to have follow up on this, we do have a comment form on our website, and we would appreciate getting the comments through that form. But for anybody who really has any major concerns, or for the major stakeholders like our industry representatives, we'd love to set up meetings after you've submitted your comments and be able to go through and understand where the pain points are, if there are any, or how we can walk away with a really good set of rules that's clear and process driven, and we all know what it's going to look like in the end. But anyway, I just want to make one other plug. I thank our attorneys on these rules and our staff at forestry. That we have well over 1,000 hours of staff time and attorney time into these rules, and they're it's 37 pages of process, and there's a reason for that, and that's just because there's not really any good examples to go from anywhere else in North America, and even in South America where they're doing some of these things, it's mostly groundwater, and so this was all kind of from scratch, and I think there's a lot of folks around the country and even in other places in the world that are looking at what Utah's doing on this, and we wanted to make sure that there weren't any questions about how this is going to happen, or question marks when we get to a certain point in the process, that we want to make sure it's clear for people who are investing into these companies that might be doing this. It's clear for the extractors, and it's clear for our folks that have to enforce these rules. So anyway, I'll end it there. And if y'all have any questions that don't really too hard on this, I'm happy to do it now, but otherwise we're happy to address them through our comment form.
Is there any examples from like the Salton Sea?
They're not far enough along yet to really have any absolute examples. In fact, I think they're like we're not in parallel tracks. They're kind of doing this a little bit differently than we are, but like royalty rates aren't very well established. I don't know, Joe, you probably know more about some of these other.
Salton Sea is geothermal, so it's not drawing from the lake. Okay.
And as far as like surface water goes, where there's actual ecological integrity that could be compromised, I think like there wasn't anywhere that we could really draw off these, and nowhere else had a statute as complicated as HB 513 to guide some of these things. So we're truly in a unique position here on Great Salt Lake.
You're going to be the leading example.
Well, and there's all of the other saline lakes in the world that are developing lithium out of their saline lakes will use this example, right? With this probably die here, we'll have one example.
So you mentioned wanting to kind of track water levels, effects on water chemistry and biodata. Are there going to be monitoring programs associated with all this?
There are. We have built into the rules some third-party monitoring.
Okay.
I don't anticipate that our division will be doing that, but I think we'd look to partners like USGS, UGS, water quality, potentially even contractors to do some of this. But yeah, there will definitely be a component of monitoring into the future.
And is there a plan to manage the data so that people can access it and track it?
That's a really good question. So we're currently, looking at how this works with record policies and what might be releasable to the public and what may not be. So those are some question marks that we're still trying to deal with. We've had a lot of inquiries about different records that we have, and even some interesting threats of litigation over some of these things. And so we're really just trying to be careful to not release anything that would harm any of the companies that are operating in a way that was a record that we should retain. And so we want to be careful that any of the data we're collecting doesn't give away trade secrets or things that we may otherwise be liable for harm or damage to these companies. So
there are components that make it into, say, a discharge permit that we would store that in our DMR system, so that would be made available. But yeah, it would be based on what you just outlined.
And I think the discharge is probably good. Like, to me, that's absolutely going to be public information as far as like what comes out of a pipe. Cause I don't think that that's something that would be fair to, to keep secret, but it's going to be dependent. Those are things that I think we need to have some further discussions with industry, as well as with water quality. And we're really trying to synchronize the processes with water quality. So I know they're working to get their rules out. And the idea here is that, we don't want to have a process that doesn't include water quality. So we may have to make some adjustments when they get out and make sure that we're not having two separate processes and it takes years to get all the permits. We want to be able to do this kind of in tandem and make it simple that way.
So yeah, I'll just note that we are concurrently working on a set of rules to address that issue. We have to provide a certificate or approval of that certification that there will be no negative impact to the biota or the chemistry, which is really unique for us too, because our Clean Water Act provisions, 401 certification, allows for some impacts as long as they're not impairing a water body. And so this is different. This is very specific, no negative impacts. So that's what our rule will focus on, the level of information that will be required for us to, to approve that certification, that self-certification. And so we just went to our board Wednesday to get an informal approval to enter into rulemaking. We have a different process than Forest Fire and State Lands because the rules go through our board. Might take a little extra time.
We don't have a board. So.
You don't have a board.
Yeah.
And so actually, Joe, he's going to assist along with 3 other of our board members on doing some review and stakeholder outreach. Hopefully we'll tag team with Forest Fire and State Lands and some of that outreach as well to get all that feedback into our draft rules. I'm not ready to talk specifics because our draft is still in the works, but it is getting really close to being able to be shared with.
And I'll say too, just in some initial conversations with Jim, we do our public meeting. If they're far enough along in their rulemaking process and it makes sense, we'd like to do it in one go with water quality. So when people come, they can ask water quality how that's going to go. We'll have a presentation on how it'll go, and hopefully people can make those connections. And so, we'll keep this group up to date, and we'll continually be updating our webpage. So if we have a new version of these rules, we'll do this. We'll have iterations, and you'll be able to see how we progress. But we do fully anticipate there are going to be versions, and we know there's things in here that we have to have some discussions about. So anyway, we're excited about the rules because we did put a lot of time and sweat into these, and there's we feel like they came out pretty good, and it's embodies what 513 was looking for. So anyway,
we only had 1 line in there, and I think ours are 8 pages long.
Yeah, like I said, if you all want to strain your brain a little bit, go back and read HB 513, and then tell me how you would have done the rules, and we'll play that game, and it's a fun one because we spent like a solid month trying to make sure we had it all.
Any other questions? Any questions? Marissa posted the link to the public comments.
It's also just on our website if you are looking for it at some point.
Yeah, and I reached out to Jeff and Ben just to kind of check thoughts here. I mean, it's real clear that we're going to need a number of studies in order to build some consensus, especially in this group, to be able to make some of the decisions we're going to be asked to make. And one of those is an understanding of the effect of brine extraction and solar ponding on the Great Salt Lake. I think we have opinions. I have opinions. You have opinions. But I don't think we have an objective understanding of what that is. We remove salt from the lake. That's a good thing. What are the other good and bad things that occur because of that? We have more evaporation and less evaporation because we have solar ponds on the lake. The last thing we wish to do is to curtail operations that may be beneficial to salinity on the lake. And so I'll circulate just kind of my little blurb so you guys can help around with my thinking. But we support this as well as a number of other studies to get some consensus, especially in this group, on those effects of lake level, salinity, salt mass, and just evaporation rate, so we can all speak as one voice and definitively understand kind of those pluses and minuses without potential bias, I guess, from the person doing the modeling. So anyway, thanks.
And I would say that, from my perspective too, I really support the idea of being able to understand the inputs and the outputs and like where we lie on these things. But I do think it's really important that we ask the question correctly and that I think the body's really well poised to be able to say, exactly what that looks like. Cause I think, we all know in some of these research questions, there's a lot of ways you can phrase it to get answers that,
Tilt one way or the
tilt one
other.
way or the other. And so I think we want to make sure that this body asks the right question, and then we do have someone that's independent to look at it. Because we know that salt leaves the system. Like we just went out and toured Cargill the other day, and what did you guys say? 850,000 tons of salt. So we know there's some impacts there. I do think that it's also important to realize, like some of these leases are on the lake bed. That's there are. I think it depends on the lake level of how much we're talking about accelerating or decreasing evaporation. But anyway, I only say that because I just think like this would be the body to start asking some of these questions. And I think as we develop a salinity management plan, we're probably going to have like a whole list of questions and how we'd want to phrase them. And I think it'd be really prudent to like really articulate our questions and understand how we're asking them and how we would, instruct a researcher or a modeler to be able to answer them. So, Jim.
I was just going to add, after branching, we did talk to Mark and Tom a little bit about some of those questions, and we're supportive of that effort. Because I do think there's some questions, some variables out here that we don't have a good handle on. And so just to your point, down and teeing up those questions and getting those questions answered, we should have the resources to get some of those questions answered. And we got to figure it out so we know how all those pieces fall.
And we do have a great opportunity. We get research grant money every year. Now it's $500,000 a year that we can expend in research grants. We really wanted to make sure that money is not being used just for like novel research, but how we actually apply it to management decisions on the lake. And so I'd really like to make sure that this coming year, when we go to offer those, and Marissa, we usually do that in like January, right? Start to offer those hot topic grants.
Yeah, I think we're trying to push it earlier and earlier so that we can.
Yeah, we'd like to give folks more time, but anyway, I think that if we could start to identify some of those key questions, this might be a good opportunity to look at, proposing some of these management hurdles that we have right now, and maybe get a couple of these studies funded, because I do think that the salinity management is critical right now, and like how we're going to manipulate the berm and how mineral industry operates and whether there's benefits or negatives or, impacts. Like those are all things we need to understand to effectively manage it. So maybe that's something we could focus on our next meeting, is starting to maybe list out some of those questions. And maybe a good exercise, Jeff, would be in advance of the meeting, sending out an email to try to develop some of those questions and bring them to this meeting. And we could spend some time just, clarifying which ones make the most sense and kind of prioritizing where they land. Because unfortunately, it's just like everything else. I think we have a short amount of time, and we're just around the corner from we'll be right in the spring before we know it. So, right. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah. That's a great suggestion. I know Laura's going to talk about the phase and integrated plan, but I know they came up with a long list of questions, and I know questions pertaining to the benefits as well as effects of mineral extraction were in there. So that might be a straw man to start from. I can pull out and then bring that.
that'd be great to everybody. Yeah, if we can, I think that would be a really productive way to spend, a good chunk of this meeting, is to look at and tackle some of these questions.
Okay, anything else from anybody? All right, well, the next item on the agenda was to start talking about we're looking in our crystal ball for what we think might happen next year with salinity, and talk about modifications to the berm. So I asked Christine if she could polish up her crystal ball and give us, see what she found here.
Okay. So, again, I'm kind of assuming that we're at our low for the year, or sorry, our high salinity for the year. So not predicting any fall and using that to carry us into the spring. And based on data that was shared by Layla and Craig on their mean monthly precipitation evaporation and inflows, I just projected that out to June of 2024 to get our estimate for. So, and I'll just list a few assumptions that are important. I ran a couple of different scenarios. One is where we raised the berm in February such that flow from south to north is cut off after that point. Up until that point, I assume the flow there is 800 CFS based on our most recent measurement, how it's been. It might go up if the level comes up, but it's set at a constant. I ran another scenario where there is no change in the berm, and I just assume it's 800 CFS until June. So those are kind of the main distinctions in those two exercises. And using that, I predict that we're going to be somewhere around 123 to 124 grams per liter in the spring. And again, this is very much a crystal ball. There are data going into this, but I don't think anyone can say what lake levels are going to do. So it is what it is.
Any thoughts on that?
This is the berm raised back to 4192.
So yeah, good question, Andrew. This would basically be the berm being raised such that all inflow is captured after February.
Okay.
So it would be some magical
Arbitrary.
height
Yes,
that
okay,
captures
it
all
captures
inflow.
everything.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
I think the lake is at 4192.2. Is that right now? And we had raised the berm to 4192 this last year.
So
So
there's really not that big of a difference in
You're just,
salinity.
yeah, well, so there's a couple of things, I guess, which is that when you don't raise the berm, you export more salt, which is why the salinity is lower. And these basic calculations, all of the inflows are in the south arm, and it's assuming that they're mixed. So in a sense, neither, like, that may be an incorrect assumption because
That
it's not.
condition that we were talking about is not.
So
It's
this is
not
like
taking
bleeding
into
off the salinity as opposed to like the salinity dump that we were talking about.
Yes.
A discrete event.
Mhm.
So this is really interesting. And I think that one other aspect of this that maybe, we ought to discuss here too, that has been floated around is, Bill brought up an idea of like, how do we better mix salinities? It comes in from the Bear River and Weber River. And I think that, this condition or this assumption that it's all mixed is based on the fact that that would be the case, and that hasn't been the case. Like, can you talk about this would be a good time to talk about those observations.
Sure.
Do you have any?
Yes, I can talk
Thoughts
about
on
that. It's a very, so yeah, Bill asked me to just think about what is the effect of Bear River on the salt flux at the breach, because many of us have observed the short circuiting of fresh water that goes through that opening. And so I did something, very simple, which let me just think about how to explain this. So I basically just took what we observed at the breach, the salt and the discharge, and I said, what's the salt flux? And then I said, well, what if that salt concentration, the salinity concentration, had been something more representative of South Arm conditions? So instead of plugging in the salinity measured at the breach, I plugged in salinity of Gilbert Bay and Carrington Bay, represented by 3510 and 2565. And I said, well, what's the salt flux if I use those concentrations instead? And these plots show the differences. And I did this for discrete moments in time where we had an actual water quality sample and an actual discharge measurement. So in April, May, June, July, that's when we had measurements. And it's kind of easier to look at the percent difference, this plot on the right. So comparing that salt flux difference between what was at the breach versus these kind of South Arm representative salinities. So they range from roughly 6% to 30% is the difference, meaning that salt flux at the breach is 6 to 30% less than it would be if we were using South Arm salinities. And here's just the numbers if anyone wants to just chew on this or walk through anything, I put that in here. And Bill, chime in if you have any comments. This was kind of your brainchild. But yeah, happy to clarify anything.
Do you have maybe I missed that, but do you have a cumulative of like what your estimate with the 6 to 30% would mean in how much difference of salt we export? I see you have
That's the
daily
difference. The
tons.
percentages are the difference in salt flux.
You're just talking like a weighted average.
Yeah, or over the season, the
It's
runoff
just- yeah.
season, would we expect that the salinity in the south arm might be like 5 grams per liter more? Like, you know what I mean? Like, could we? do you have any
No,
estimates
I
on-
didn't take it that far. And
Okay.
what's really tricky about this then is that this is all based on discrete points in time. And making assumptions about how this would behave over a month or a season. You kind of inject a lot of assumptions and a lot of uncertainty into a calculation like that. So just for back of the envelope, very simple, I just did with data that we actually have. And then if we were to extrapolate that to a larger time step and get a cumulative flux, which then would allow us to analyze the effect on south arm salinity. That would be a little more involved and be a little bit more of a guessing game. But maybe not, because what's really encouraging about what Andy showed about the stage discharge relationship, this wouldn't take us all the way back to May or April, but is that we could actually get a really reasonable daily discharge at the breach, which would eliminate the limitation here, which is that we only have measurements at discrete points in time. So we could kind of try to use the rating curve that Andy developed to get more kind of a more complete picture on the salt flow differences, the salt flux differences between Bear River versus non-Bear River affected salinity.
Is there any percentage in analyzing what happened this year in the runoff, knowing that once it started to spill, we had like a 6 to 30% difference in what we would have expected if it was fully mixed versus what we actually got, to try to make some relationships between like how we would project it versus what happened last year?
I think we
Is that-
definitely could do that.
Number crunching.
Yeah, yes, and that would be a next step. I just didn't,
Okay.
didn't take it quite that far. It's just to give you a general
The
idea.
only reason I ask is like, we're gonna have to make some decisions on either just like not touching it or doing this soon, and then it'd be really nice to know, if it was only a few grams per liter, it seems to me like the maybe leaving it is the best way to do things. And
Yeah.
maybe we got lucky and we found this like nice elevation that just works, but
But
if
you'd
it-
be missing out on the mixing.
exactly,
opportunity,
but we might be missing out on this mixing opportunity, and maybe
As opposed to a big discrete.
well, maybe this is a good year and this is like the last great opportunity we have to do this one more time. Like, I don't know. I just feel like there's some risk.
Bill has a question.
Yeah, I just want to, so Christine, thanks so much for doing that. And boy, I didn't mean for this to put you on the spot, but this is really helpful because it does suggest it's significant. If we can mix the lake better, we can actually have a very large improvement in the way we can control salinity and export salt more effectively if we want. So I totally agree that this could be tightened up by putting more effort into it. But I think I threw this at Christine on a Friday night for all I remember, and she turned it around really quick. So I really appreciate you doing that. Remember that what's going through the breach, when we want to talk about improving mixing, we're not going to control that at the breach. We're talking about controls in other places to force mixing. And so to me, what Christine's analysis in terms of the salinity that we obtain, whether we raise the berm or not, is it shows it's not very sensitive, so that the raising of the berm is really more about lake elevation than it is about salinity under the current circumstances. And so I just kind of want to point that out, that really the take home message for me, at least from her analysis, is the berm elevation isn't under the current circumstances going to affect salinity all that much. And that's good, right? Because that means we don't critically have to do anything with respect to the salinity. But elevation is another question.
And Bill, I would just maybe make one comment on that, is that that's assuming that water would be spilling. If we were to say, take it back to the condition when it wasn't open and completely shut it off for a period of time and allow that mixing to happen and say, open it up in September and, take it back down to 4187, then we would have better mixing at that point, right? I mean, you're not going to end up with it just sitting there.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Ben. Yeah, I need to correct that. If we just close the system, it'll mix. That's true.
And so like your initial assumption when you gave us the two projections was that no water was missing, going through. And so I think that that's an important distinction and that, and perhaps part of the discussion. I don't think that we really want to seal everything off, but I think these are all parts of the discussion. And if there's no need to, like, we can stay in a good salinity range, then then we don't need to do that. But I do think it'd be worth investigating how well it's mixing and understanding of how much actual difference it's going to make in South Arm salinity. So I don't know what that would take, Christine, if that's, I
Yeah.
know.
It's really tricky, Ben, because it's
Yeah.
like, I was looking at the profile data, so the like kind of water quality profile we take at the breach. And I was kind of, Ryan and I, or not Ryan and I in the past have observed a lens where it's a freshwater lens and it's kind of affected by part of it. This year, it was the entire water column. So if I checked, conductivities, which is our proxy for salinity in the field, versus conductivities in the South Arm, they were completely different across the entire water column. So I don't know if that's a 2023 thing, which it may have been. So a couple of things are to look at previous years. This may have been extraordinary. And then I forget what I was going to say, but I think that it's just hard to know how much that Bear River water is mixing on its way to the breach. Like, we know it's really affecting flows there. I have no idea how much diffusion or advective mixing is happening on its way there, that it actually is diluting South Arm on its way. I'm sure it is to a large extent.
I just flew it this week and it is bypassing. It's going right from Bear River, right around the Bryan Term Harbor to.
Does any user on the lake benefit from that bypass of fresh water?
I don't think so. All instances, like, you don't want fresher water going in.
The only negative impact I see is navigation.
Oh, totally.
Airboaters and that
Well,
kind of thing.
but I think, like, in talking with folks who are in the know, there's structures that could be put in that are like, J hooks or something that like force the water to come around Fremont Island. Like, the initial thought was that there could be like a peninsula or something that would, be a physical barrier. And I agree, like, that's not ideal either. We don't want to create more navigational hazards or issues. But if there were structures that could be put in river that could force the water to point south and come around Fremont, that spend more time.
Isn't it
Maybe
based on elevation though? Isn't there like a high point between Ogden Bay and?
There is a bench there.
Yeah,
Well, you're talking on the south side of Fremont.
yeah, to get it around the
Well,
island.
there is,
yeah.
but if you had that much water coming out, don't you think there'd be some erosion to that strait? I mean, even that.
The elevation of that berm is at 94.5. So the lake would have to come up several feet to be able to force the water through. Or we'd have to dredge.
Well, that's even another thing. Maybe that's in the works. Maybe there is a reason to look at doing
We
We
that.
just said we need a mile-long jetty at the Bryan Shrimp Harbor and then put a
Yeah,
little hook on the end.
There you go. Keep it all going. Anyway, I think these are all pretty valid questions, and maybe we shouldn't raise the berm and we should focus on better mixing. But I don't know if there's enough bang for the buck there. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Hey, can I ask another dumb question? Sorry, this is you
never have to.
like actually put the pen to paper and give us answers, and I'd ask the dumb questions, I guess. But if you were just to take your assumption that there's a 6 to 30%, and just apply that and say like, okay, our average discharges in the North Arm, and you said on the low end it's 6%, high end it's 30% different, and then give that range and say, assuming that the flows were constant, assuming all these things, here's what we might expect in the the amount of salt, and then just do that salt mass balance with the South Arm. This is maybe what we might expect. I mean, that seems pretty simple, and I know it's rudimentary. There's a lot of assumptions and other things, but at least it would give us a glimpse.
Totally. We can certainly do that. I'm happy to do that.
Do you think is that too rudimentary and dumb? Like, does it not give us answers? Is it?
It does inform the impact of that scenario on South Arm salinity. And then I think it's just part of the exercise of us all understanding is digging into the assumptions and the caveats.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a good exercise to do. I'll give it a shot.
That would be awesome. I
Talk
think
about
if we
Yeah.
could just even get just a glimmer of what it might mean to South Arm salinity, it would really help. Sorry,
Yeah.
Tim.
No, and I know we're sort of blending into the next agenda item, but I think another interesting variable here, and it is important, it does touch on this, is is even the assumption of like a February closure. We did raise the berm February last year because I think that was about as soon as we could get it done, just given a lot of practical realities and everything else. I think one of the really interesting dynamics when you look at this winter is, last winter, every reservoir was full shut, right? This year already water managers are looking at it where reservoirs are, many of them are 80 plus. So they're projecting, and if we get even normal precip, they're going to start spilling those reservoirs clear through the winter. So you're gonna have a lot of water released well before February, and so that's just something that sort of figures into these discussions. If you want to capture that, or we need to use it for dilution, or we don't need to use it for dilution, it sort of figures into that question of when are you making these modifications, or when are you making these calculations?
If I could ask, Christine, I see you're using a fixed export volume of 800 CFS. I mean, is it 800 now, or when we went out there a
Around
couple weeks, it was
800.
900?
Yeah, so it's ranged from around 800 to like 1200 since May, I think. Andy, correct me if I'm wrong. So I just, that was just a judgment call I made, and I
But
can
we
adjust
reasonably
that.
expect that to be higher
Yes,
as we progress
exactly.
into the water.
Yep. Exactly.
So maybe even upping that a little to see what the difference is.
Yeah, because I think that's
Sure.
reasonable.
It's gonna go up, yeah.
And if, Christine, I know that, like, I apologize that it seems like you must dread these meetings because every time you leave, like, you leave and you have to, there's like all these questions we ask that you end up holding the bag on. But I really do think if just having that, that could inform a lot of the conversation that I think folks are having too about whether any of these structures, would be helpful, but then also if it makes any sense to raise the berm or just it's at.
Bill?
Yeah, just looking at the image on the right that Christine has up, you can visually put a curve through the 3 green dots and the 3 blue dots and picture the areas under those. And it's the difference between those 2 areas that's the difference in the cumulative salt flux, right? The salt mass exported. And so it's going to be very significant. And it is very possible, since you can see that also what's driving this is discharge as it increases during the spring and through the early or last part of spring through June. And so she will be able to fill this in. This will be a good estimate. It's not just a glimmer. It's not going to be a bad estimate, in my opinion, because she showed earlier that the breach discharge can be pretty well constrained. And so, so I think it's a really worthwhile exercise. And I do like the idea of considering seriously, though, these structures to divert flow southward without having to impact navigability. And it is quite realizable to dredge a bit. It's only about a meter of extra sediment height. And a quick geophysical survey could be done to make sure there's no rock under there, but it's almost certain there isn't. So that you could dredge a small channel to get the flow started. And then it is steep enough on the west side of that sediment ledge that you will erode down a much bigger channel as the flow starts to go. It won't back up because it's much steeper down towards the center of the south arm. So there should be no feasibility issue here. And then finally, you could put the artists onto the jetties, and why have just one spiral jetty, right? You could have a bunch.
I'm half joking here, but we're long on salt, so that you put a salt berm. And you can circumvent salt's allowed to be discharged on the lake bed from a core standpoint. Again, half joking.
I think with, having Bill as one of the folks that I, look up to with his knowledge of how this stuff works, and Christine as well, agreeing that maybe this isn't the worst idea. I would love it if you could do this. And then if we could, maybe we don't have to wait till the next Salinity meeting. Maybe if there's something you could report back. I know there's a lot of discussions about, in our department about what the next steps might be. And like to Tim's point, it might be that we want to, like, depending on how things progress with this year, we may want to be doing this sooner than later. So, yeah, if you don't mind, Christine, then
Right
I
on.
really appreciate it. We're gonna have to find some time to go buy you a lunch or something that's worthwhile.
Maybe about the Astro Burger or something.
Yeah, you let me know. I owe you at least at one lunch, maybe more.
I guess just to to provide some perspective, Christine, could you put the slide you had showing the historical salinity? And just, and in terms of if we're at 124 grams per liter this spring, and Bonnie has a great idea to have a pool, place some bets on what it'll be. I guess she doesn't want you to participate. But I'm just thinking, if we're at 124 in the spring, where might that put us in the fall? Are we still pushing 160 potentially? I think usually we've been 20 to 30 grams per liter each year of increase. I think that would put us in that 140 to 150 range. I'm just thinking, the further we look out, the more and more uncertainty there is. But I think you brought up a great point at the beginning is, how we want to make sure we're setting ourselves up, if 2023 was an anomaly, what happens if we, in subsequent years? And I think, from what we've talked about in the past is, if we're at 124, we should be below that 160 threshold, in the 140 to 150 threshold, this until the fall of 2024. And then we could evaluate what we need to do.
One other just quick point too is that I think that the old model of 35 grams per liter raising, I think that might be a little bit different now that we're exporting water to the north all summer. That might be another good thing for us to revisit about, what the seasonal salinity looks like. Maybe this year just had a really, a much slower evaporation. Can you guys comment on that about what you observed in your ponds? Is it consistent with other years? Or?
It's a little bit softer, yeah, a little bit slower, just because of the relative humidity. The monsoon moisture seemed to be here for the whole summer.
We really didn't come up as much as I thought we would this year. And so that might be an interesting factor in this. Is like, if we were just going to say, leave the berm where it was today and let it just see how things go for the next few years, maybe we're not seeing those big seasonal swings just because of the constant, discharge in the forefront. But anyway.
Well, and the prevention of any backflow north to south.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's on the next agenda item here is, wanted to just think through that question of should we raise the berm this winter? And I think Tim's point about, when spring runoff might come or when we get the winter runoff, I think is a great point. Usually when I've looked at this for past years, I think the lake would often come up a foot in December. We haven't seen that recently. So that's a foot of water that could be captured and could be, might be 2 feet of water instead of 1 foot of water, if the berm was closed. So anyway, any thoughts from anybody else on?
I'm going to stay consistent with where I was last year, where I got my mind around kind of a discrete, 2 month, 2.5, 3 month dump. Open it up, dump it, build it back up, and really contain that mix. I know that's harder from a management perspective.
That to me, it's really not. Like, if we need to modify it twice in a year, that's fine. If we got the funding to do that, it was appropriated, and we're using some of that for monitoring and everything. But if that's what's best for the lake, we can do that. I think it's just now it's a matter of deciding that's truly going to have the best impact.
Just quick, there's a part of me that in some sense you want muscle memory or you want to test stuff. And so there's a part of me that, you wants that more active approach, which shows that, hey, we can build it up, we can take it down, Joe, to your point, right? Show that it sort of underscores this adaptive nature of it. It is logistically more challenging, right? And more costly to do it that way. But it is interesting how this low-tech solution has been delivering, whereas a highly mechanical one may be not working. So well, it worked for a period of time and then predictably break down.
But to your point though, Tim, a few minutes ago, reservoirs are up. Okay, you know, it's wet in the uplands. So it's setting up even for an average snow year, it's setting up for an efficient runoff year.
Right.
I think just based on general observations in like October being above average, and we're getting a ton of rain today. I live in Bountiful and I have a little rain meter that measured an inch already. So I think this is a pretty impressive start to the year, but if it keeps up like that, it'll be interesting to see where things end up. A lot of decisions that need to be made in the next month, 2 months. Yeah, we don't meet weekly, huh, Christine?
Yeah, too bad.
You can have like a full-time job just doing this.
You on the payroll yet?
Yeah.
Yes, what are the downsides to raising the berm? I mean, it sounds like if we raise the berm or we don't raise the berm, at least these calculations show we probably wouldn't see much change in the salinity this spring.
I mean, I would just say one thing, and my assumption is that raising it to 4192 doesn't really buy us a lot. So if we were going to do anything this year, it would be like the equation of just like completely impounding all the water. But then you get into the scenario, then you have to plan on going back and releasing it and deciding when that's going to happen. But if we impound all the water in starting in December, January, or February, because all the reservoirs are releasing, like we may not be able to get back in there and do that while we have a ton of runoff coming through the Bear River. So I don't know how long it would take to release that. But I don't know.
My guess is that if we had it up and you had that kind of inflow, is that it wouldn't take much for an excavator to trigger a catastrophic erosion of the berm.
I think the Army Corps, they allow us to maintain this, and they've kind of said you don't have to do anything to maintain it, but if we were just like knocking rocks out of the way, they might not love it getting discharged out of the north arm. So maybe with the buried stretch, how fast it goes out, right? But anyway,
Look at the video, December 1st, 17.
Well, I want to be clear, Joe, you were almost thinking like it's almost take it down to get released, right? And then build up.
Yeah, I
right?
mean-
Because then your export is more predictable.
Yeah, so I mean,
Is that, am I
just throwing around
understanding?
numbers, like you knock it down to 89 tomorrow through, mid-January, whenever we align on like when the water year, when we want to really start capturing.
I had the same thought exercise the other day, and I was thinking about when we were at 4194 and there was 2 feet of headroom, how much we were actually moving, and there's like 1200 CFS going through. So even today with only, we're at 4192.2 at the low spots, 4189, we're still seeing like 900 CFS. What gain would we actually get by dropping it down to 4189 or 4187? Like if we even increased it by like 300 CFS, I'm not good at math, but I don't think it's going to equate to a lot of water. I mean, we might see like 150,000 acre feet max by spring. So I just don't know that it's in the cards this year. Maybe in the future, we need to be more aggressive.
I
about
understand what
taking
you're
it
saying,
down.
but I haven't estimated like what that would be. That's helpful with Christine's. LiDAR.
It's kind of that, you mentioned it, the plug versus the steady drip, right?
Yeah.
We're in a steady drip mode right now.
But the steady drip should be increasing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it'll increase as, if they do start opening, that's gonna increase that export, right? So if we're at nadir right now and we start coming up, as they start opening reservoirs, then we'll see more export.
I just don't know, like maybe that's another question for Christine. How much can actually be moved through this? Like if we dropped it down another couple feet to 4187, like how much would we actually increase?
I mean, I don't know, but it is a V notch now, and I know when we opened it in 2016, it was an immense amount of flow, like
Yes.
upwards of 4,000 CFS.
Oh, and it's-
So, I mean, if you have a channel that's shaped like that, a rectangle versus a notch, I imagine there would be a substantial more flow, but I
mean,
don't know.
What about why didn't we see it so much more in June then when that dropped? Because we had at that point you were almost dealing with like a 5-foot difference, right? From the V to the top, and we only saw 1200 CFS,
We did see a big increase
300 CFS, right?
comparatively.
That's not that much.
0 to 1200 is a big difference.
Well, no, it was already flowing over because there was 2 feet of headroom. It
Mhm.
wasn't zero.
But the delta is 300.
Yeah, exactly. So the difference of when it,
But that's a
we saw
third.
that-
I mean, it's.
I'm just saying, like, we're not, even right now with what we're seeing pushing through the breach, that's still not that much water. Like, when we look at like what we'll have by February, like, that's a really small river. It's not like it'll fill up the north arm. And so even if we double the flows, like, it's still not gonna make that big of an impact on the north arm, is my point.
The tough part of this is we're having trouble understanding this two-dimensional, you know, math question. When you start putting time into it, which is really the key. There's no sense sending Bear River water to the north arm. That's not gonna help Compass or anybody else. Yeah, we've got to build elevation in order to have the driver to be able to push through the berm. So the timing of it is probably more important or as important as how much and elevation of the berm itself. And that's hard because I don't think we have a feel for the first question, let alone the 25th question.
And if we're going through this effort, you know, Compass and me are supportive of the Bear River doing its work, you know, and having that maximum residence time to actually.
Yeah, I think it makes a difference. I mean, like, it's gonna be better for you if you get.
Yeah,
more
I mean,
concentrated
it's bleeding
water
right
stream.
now. I mean, I understand what you're saying. Maybe it's not more than bleeding. You know, as opposed to the discrete dump versus a bleeding off.
I mean, I think the idea is we just want to be as efficient as possible. So if there was something we needed to do, like right now, we have that burn money. If we needed to like pay to do some additional modeling or something to try to answer these questions, to me, it's just more of like, what is the question? Because we have 25 of them. And it's like trying to get like boil it down and decide what is our decision going to be based off of. That might be a good way to, yeah.
I think the other really pressing engineering question, and it doesn't relate directly to the breach, but it is this mixing question. And it seems like we just need to put some thought to that. I mean, in theory, you know, if you divert the Bear River more south and east, right? But in practice, like, what would that cost? What's the permitting, right? Like, are there low tech solutions that will give you 80% of the benefit, right? That you can implement much quicker. I mean, these are kind of some really interesting questions. I didn't know who's qualified to take a look at those, but it seems like those are some questions that, I mean, we're not going to answer those questions in the next month or two, but we need to be thinking about them and considering them and trying to figure out, you know, what can we realistically do? What's the ROI? You know, that kind of stuff.
Lynn.
Dumb question, but if the Bear River is developed, how does that factor into what we're talking about now?
How long would it take to develop the Bear River?
I don't know, but if
That's huge.
that was eventually diverted, and you know, given the fact that this is an ongoing thing that I think we'll be talking about beyond us, I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I mean, we can just say a few things right off the bat, Lynn. I mean, one is it's the biggest contributor to fresh water. So if you reduce the amount of contribution of fresh water, then you also limit some loading, right? From that source. But the other is the adaptive management relies on head differential between south and north.
But I think it's safe to say that a reduction of flows coming from the Bear River is going to negatively impact the lake. So anything that we do today that puts in structures to better mix Bear River water coming in could be the benefits could be minimized if we don't have flows, but then also just the amount of water load. So I mean, I think everybody agrees on that. But I know that project's still hanging out there, so you're right. I mean, that's something
That's why I asked.
we ought to be cognizant of it.
Just
This might be silly, but is there a safety net elevation for the north arm that we would feel comfortable with to help us decide if we want to raise the berm? And I know it didn't change much this year, even though, moisture, monsoonal season, not a lot of evaporation, but a lot of that fresh water was evaporating when it came in to the north arm. Just so we don't get any backflow. Like, is 189 good, or?
You mean like the head difference?
Yeah,
between
the head
two?
difference.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know off the top of my head. I know Thom and his team at Utah State are using this pressure head differential to try and estimate flows. And I'm sure we could come up with some difference of understanding when we expect the head on the north arm to drive flow to the south
Yeah.
and try to, I can ask them if they have an answer.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a crux, right? For when we want to raise the berm. What are we gonna expect this winter? Is it gonna go up to 90? And is that a threshold? Do we want to keep it at 189?
Like, I would also just say too, I think that just in general, as we're managing salinity and coming up with that plan, that's something that we should consider is what is the ideal head difference? Because I think another reason, that maybe we didn't see salinity raise in the south arm is that all of the flows that go through the entire causeway, none of that's happening. It's all going south to north. And so I don't think any of us know what those inputs are, but I think there's a lot of benefits in limiting the amount of north to south flow.
Yeah.
So we should establish that. I think that's a great point. Like, whether it's a foot, maybe it has to be 2 feet to really see those benefits.
Yeah. And that might give us the trigger moment to raise the berm.
Related to head difference, is the railroad given anybody any kind of guidance as to, what's this say? Head difference from an engineering perspective, can we just?
We've tried to avoid that question because so far they've just been absolutely willing to work with us. So
When the culverts collapsed, where we had a 4-foot differential, that was an emergency.
It was 3 feet at its max right before the now bridge occurred.
But they were flowing in spring from the culverts.
I mean, I guess I'm just asking, can we just?
Well, I mean, from an engineering standpoint, you're not holding back the whole lake, right? You're holding back that like triangle of water that's there. So, I mean, is it really?
I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I'm just asking. I'm just asking the question.
My non-engineering understanding of this is like we built dams that are 100 feet tall and hold back, all these reservoirs, and I don't know that there's much of an engineering hurdle. Like I did touch on this with the railroad guys,
Okay.
and they didn't seem concerned about that at all. And I briefly posed the question because I didn't want that to be the problem with the berm, but like that didn't seem like it was even an issue for them. And they're constantly dealing with the settling, so I think like they're dealing with unstable surface in the first place. So I think they're able to adapt on that, but I don't know. I think we should keep going until the railroad tells us they're serious.
And then we'll have the Bear River diversion once we have a big train that's laid out from
Yes.
Fremont all the way over to.
Hopefully it's carrying like sponges or something that helps solidify that.
Listen, is there I guess, in terms of something to be able to evaluate, I feel like, we have a lot of different options. I think sometimes it's easier if we can focus on a hypothesis or a straw man to say, if we were to raise the berm to 4195, that allows us to capture 3 feet of water this spring, with the assumption that we follow our protocol where we open it up again next summer.
The question is, what do you do before you raise it to 4195? Like, do you let it bleed in now, or do you deepen it, have that dumped, and then build 4195?
When you do 4195, maybe the ideal timing is letting like more of it flow for the next 3 months or something. There's a lot of.
I think I know our question is already, John. I think that's still the 4195 now. It's
Right.
problematic, but if that's February 3rd like it was last year, then that's different.
A lot of comments on there. Do you?
Yeah, I'll read. So John Luff said it does seem like the impact of the berm is more important to reduce north to south flow than losing the pressure surface water. And what if we were to manage the Bear River Bay at the trapezoid and decide when it is released to promote better mixing instead of the promontory? So use
Adding another layer, John.
using the trapezoid as a storage.
What does Craig say about it?
Bonnie said, I like that. Craig said the wild card is north arm sesh driven by winds.
True.
I think at our tour, UP said that they've been learning how to break up the waves before they hit the causeway. And that's the water level is higher, and now those waves are hitting that different part of the causeway.
Another, maybe not so obvious solution would be, does anybody know of, surface, improvements that could be put in, like, to help mixing, from the surface? We're not putting it, something temporary that's like buoys that float that help promote, mixing as it's traveling through. Cause I wonder if that would make sense to, invest into something that could do that from the surface. I just don't know if those items exist, but
I know.
maybe engineers.
On the Columbia River and the reservoirs there, they put big floating booms with curtains that hang down 50, 100 feet, all to divert Columbia River flow to a different part of the reservoir.
You could even angle things like that. So not only do they push it down, but they push it out away from the berm. So I'm wondering if you anchored something like off of the causeway and pushed it away from the opening, that you could help to push it down, mix, and move it away.
If the flow's more turbulent, it would promote mixing, right? So I mean, a low-tech solution could just be throwing big rocks out there.
There also is this really interesting question of where you put it, right? So the closer you are to the mouth of Bear River, the fresher that water. There's not a lot to mix, right?
Yeah.
It's very fresh. And so it has to push out either south or west some distance before you're even kind of in contact with salty enough water for it to start doing the job of mixing. You could put things on the existing, mouth of the Bear River. It wouldn't do a lick of good, right? You're just mixing fresh water.
What do we have, like 8 miles between that and the breach or something though? There's quite a bit of space.
Oh, there's a ton of space, and that's what's shocking about the fact that it transits that far and then transits into the North Arm, and then you can see it in the North Arm even clearer because it doesn't mix there either.
I mean, is it also finding that sweet spot too, where it has done some mixing, so it's not such a big difference in concentration, so it doesn't create that difference? Because like in the North Arm, that makes sense because it's like olive oil on water, right?
Yeah.
But maybe finding that sweet spot, and maybe a boom is a real low-tech solution that could be deployed pretty quick. That makes more sense than a berm. I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing this out there because I think like at this point, we don't have a lot of time. We do need to think about what's possible and what's going to have the best benefit. And a boom is something that could be deployed and taken down relatively easy. So it doesn't have to hang out there forever. It could be done in the years where we have the opportunity to do it.
It's just that you're going to have an operations group to do it. Because, it's not something that we can just go deploy and forget about it for 6 months. It's
They have
going to
blue
get
uniforms, I'm in.
Me in too. I've been looking.
it's going to get hammered by the waves out there, and that's going to need babysitting. So it's not permanent like a dike would be, but and I'm sure it's cheaper to build. But
You could try a lot of stuff without it permanently.
And the permitting, like I don't think there'd be much to permit on something like this
That'd
with the
be-
core. So
a navigational issue, not a bill issue. So I think there are things that we can do, for mixing. That's certainly one train of thought we need to explore. I think the more immediate, see, there's more comments coming in.
That boom would have to be that deep either, just point that out, like.
Right.
Yeah, it's supposed to be on the surface.
that seems like a relatively low cost, high impact way to get some.
Because Ben and I are out there Christmas Eve trying to wrestle this.
Yeah.
back.
That actually,
Waves.
that sounds excellent to me. That's the way that I would absolutely like to spend my Christmas Eve.
This is all the more reason for Christine's modeling to help us understand when you pull this lever, how is it connected to anything? It doesn't do any good.
I agree.
So go ahead.
Just a question, is there any understanding of kind of surface or currents in the South Arm, and could we tap into that, like of knowing where to put a structure like that to then have South Arm gyre if there is one, just take it south for you? Is there enough information to know
I
that?
don't think I've seen information that would give us that level of detail.
I forget the author, but like a 70s vintage sort of compendium of GSL. There's a whole thing on
Was that
Yeah,
the
circulation.
GPS compendium?
Well, I think Wally Gwynn's
it's,
book that used to be in the bookstore here.
Is it detailed enough?
it has like the aerial
Has a map.
photo of the lake. I'm not saying it's modern,
Yeah.
but it's not.
I mean, that's been something I thought would be a good study to understand like what circulation patterns exist. And it probably changes with like deep brine layers and other.
Right.
I believe it's actually in the CMP too, if I recall.
Good
But
job,
I
you know the
used it.
CMP better than me. They make it look that good.
Well, we got people with sailboats on the lake, they would probably be sharing some of that information.
Our UGA book is coming out. It's a guidebook on Great Salt Lake. There's a couple of chapters that highlight some of the circulation.
But I mean, I think the short circuiting is just a natural hydrodynamic process. I took a picture I saw last month of a small pond, but the same thing where there's a culvert coming in and culvert coming out. And you can totally see how the water is just going straight to the culvert. And that's just, water is going to find the path of least resistance, and momentum reduces resistance. So it's a matter of, can we increase the resistance and
A lot of right hand
that water?
corners, right?
Maybe we need to do like a rubber ducky race. We'll release the duckies at Bear River, and we'll see which ducky
You're genius.
can
GPS.
get into the north on first.
Especially when you get like,
$5 a duck.
yeah, we could probably get like UNICEF or one of these companies to like do a charity.
But the group for like the landscape art, the name,
Idea.
Chloe,
Chloe, they wanted to do that with the Barron's Trench, like put a, kind of, yeah, like have a kite essentially project out of the Barron's Trench and watch the kite go along.
Are there, there's like tracers and things that could be put in as well, right? I mean, that's pretty low tech. High visibility, and we could do something like that. That would be.
People love seeing water turn red.
Yeah, I was just,
We'll have green site for the next 3 years.
I was just looking at the topography a little bit, and it's that west end of Prom, there's a natural high spot comes out. That it's actually surprising that it doesn't do more to disrupt that water, but I was just sort of looking just at to see how it hooks out, right?
Oh, yeah.
Not far from where you guys are at, Joe, but anyway, that's just kind of interesting. It's a natural high spot. It's not having that effect now. But if you were to deploy something, that would be a pretty sensible place.
Makes sense.
Got the saltier water by the time you go out there.
Well, if I can,
I was gonna say, maybe based on the, if it's easy enough to crunch those numbers and give that really preliminary range, maybe that'll help advance this conversation, see if it's worthwhile to look at better mixing as a solution for this year, maybe even coming years.
Beyond the entertainment side.
Yeah, beyond Mark and I swimming out there on Christmas Eve in our orange floats. Oh, I've got the kind that go on your arms. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
great, well, I guess to summarize is, the numbers that Christine crunched and presented show that the salinity change isn't going to be significant if we raise the berm or if we leave the berm as is. But that's raised questions as to the efficacy of, how can we mix the Bear River flow better so that we can maximize the export of water through there. And then there's a number of questions that I'm gonna listen to the recording and try to get those all down. And then I can get that back out to the group, and especially to nail down what numbers we need to crunch.
And I guess I want to clarify something, and I should have done this like a half hour ago. Both of the scenarios I presented where it's saying berm raised, not raised, they're just in the simplicity of this mass balance equation, they are both assuming that inflows are mixed in the south arm, which is an incorrect assumption. So I just want to make that clear, that it's showing that there's not a big difference in salinity, but that's because both scenarios are showing that it's completely mixed. And in one of them, that is true, and then the other is not. So yes, right, gets back to the point of like, I'll do these calculations and we'll get a little more clarity on that, but just, yes.
Yep. And then we can bracket it by saying, well, what if that salt mass exported is 6 to 30% less due to the Bear River influence? So then we can get a better idea of that. I think the other key principles are, one is that we want to try to take advantage of getting water into the North Arm. We want to be able to take advantage of the inflows that we see over the winter, spring, to try to dilute what we have in the South Arm. as much as we can. And then looking at again next summer, flushing water back into the north arm. So I guess our goal as a committee is really to keep a handle on the salinity. And I think, Bill brought up a great point too. There's the lake level component of this as well. That, but the numbers that we're crunching really are focused on the salinity piece of this. So I think action items are one. I'll summarize the questions, and then Christine, got some work cut out for you to crunch these numbers, and we'll try to get those out to the group as soon as we can. And then I think what we'll want to do, I guess everybody can be thinking about the pros and cons of raising the berm. And I think the scenario really is what she computed was if we raise the berm high enough where it would be able to store this winter, spring runoff, and then to dilute, mix that water, and then be able to flush it out next summer after spring runoff. So that's the working hypothesis or scenario that we're thinking about. So if you could all please think about pros and cons of that. There's a lot to think about, lot to think through there. But I think, well, I know we've got the smart people here, so we just want to make sure we try to understand what we're getting into. So, all right. Any last questions or comments on that?
I guess just one of the conversations we were trying to have out there on the causeway was how would you build a new or revised berm? So, if we're going to build it the same way and expect, we may have some erosion and go back to where it started from, then that's okay. If we want to do something different, more, I guess, substantial or permanent, then the engineer's going to have to start soon, I guess.
Well, I noticed the rocks that are left are at least 3 feet. So I think that's a place to start. Is so we want to make sure we don't use rocks that are smaller than 3 feet.
If we're not topping it too, I think there's less risk of it eroding, right? That's another factor. More control over that.
Great. Oh, Laura,
Hey,
you want to
come up there.
Yes, please.
Well, no, I'll just come sit next to.
Well, that's the one.
If I could get a couple. Oh, you're welcome. The doctor ordered Lynn's cookies.
It's only people in the stage.
Well, I love the minutia of this discussion. I miss it, but then I think if you guys could all take a breath and a step back in like a 36,000 foot view of the lake and the Great Salt Lake Basin, I'll talk just a real quick minute about the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. Ben, thank you for the invite to come chat today. We have, we're rolling out a work plan real soon, so we just wanted to make you all aware of that. And this is my second presentation of the morning, so forgive me, I just think they're happening so fast. I wanted to make sure you had some of the latest things, but also, you guys all know a lot about this, so I can breeze through a ton of it, including all this Great Salt Lake elevation stuff. And I think the important thing that when I talk to people about this project is that I tell them that this project is a result of HB 429, which was the last legislative session. And it was because of low Great Salt Lake levels, but this isn't a project to maximize water for Great Salt Lake. It's not a project just for Great Salt Lake. It's a project that will help us understand all of the water uses in the Great Salt Lake Basin in general. So people are sometimes relieved to hear this isn't strictly a water to Great Salt Lake project. So I will pass over these. You've all seen this. This is just the recent, the point I make with this slide is that while we had a tremendous increase in elevation there, we're still at low lake levels, staggeringly low lake levels that we were back when we broke the old 1963 historic low of 4193. So we're nowhere out of the woods, and that's my point with this slide. But when I talk to people about this integrated plan, I think of it as a puzzle. And when we're looking at the Great Salt Lake Basin, we're trying to understand how water moves in the basin. We don't have a complete picture of the puzzle. So we're missing pieces. And we're with regard to surface water and groundwater. And we're not comparing apples to apples. So like if Jordan River Water Conservancy District has one way of monitoring or measuring and Weaver Basin has another, folks, USGS has another, like, no, there's not all, we're not all using the same tools and the same data. And so this plan or project is seeking to get all of the data together. And then this is what I think is my puzzle now is the Great Salt Lake Basin. So trying to put all these pieces together to have a complete picture of the water puzzle in the basin where I'm headed. So I think you guys are fully aware of the need of the water, developing this integrated plan for the basin, stressed resources. There's lots of data out there, but there's no consensus on methods. Problem, we've never done a project at this scale in Utah. There's been basin plans done in other states that are looking at some of the rivers and lakes in other parts of the West, but never here in Utah. And those, a lot of the time, are just assessments. They're not making action. They don't have an action plan at the end, and this project is proposing to have that. And we also need, we just need some direction. If the legislature comes to us, or if federal partners come to us and they're like, where are you headed for Great Salt Lake Basin? What's your desire for the overall vision of how we want to see water used in this basin? We don't really have an answer right now. And so developing that for future uses is, I think, going to be invaluable. And the goal of this project was a goal that was we wordsmith this with a lot of the steering committee and advisory groups that I'll talk about in a minute. But the goal of the project is to ensure a resilient water supply for Great Salt Lake and all of the water uses in the watershed. So like I said, it's not just for Great Salt Lake, and it's not just for agricultural uses in the watershed, it's for everybody. And so per HB 429, we're taking an integrated look at how all of these things will help us build a resilient water supply for Great Salt Lake. We look at how much water Great Salt Lake needs, how much water is available in the system, how much do communities demand now, and then what do we think they'll be demanding in the future? And then how is water quality impacted by the supply and the demand? Also, we're encouraged to take a look at how stormwater is impacted and watersheds, how watershed management, forest management could impact watershed health. And just to give you an idea, or kind of the objectives of HB 429, to meet water quality objectives, agricultural water objectives, accommodate for growth and economic development, and provide for adequate flow to Great Salt Lake and wetlands, and other ecological functions in the watershed. One thing I neglected to mention was when the study was funded during the 2022 legislative session, we got news that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation also wanted to participate or come to the table, join the party, and they are now a partner in this study, and we're also doing conjunctively Great Salt Lake Basin study, and their emphasis is providing a trade-off analysis to help decision makers balance water supply demand and avoid deterioration of agriculture industry and ecosystems. So the Bureau of Reclamation is a partner in all of this, and you all know all of the other potential partners and people and projects that are going on. There's been so much happening in recent years with the Water Trust, the Strike Teams, USGS and their Saline Lakes the IWAS work. There's also plenty more to come. Forestry doing the update to the CMP, the Senator Romney's Great Salt Lake Recovery Act, sending money to the Army Corps to do some work there. So we've got lots of projects in the works and lots lined up, and we just want to make sure they're all complementing each other. And then right now, this is just to give you an idea of the timeline. It's not a project that's going to be done tomorrow, much to many's dismay, but like talking about this vision and this long-term guidance for the watershed, I think is going to take a little bit of time. So in 2023, we've been creating this work plan. Oh, I also neglected to say that I am lucky enough to have Jeff here leading the show with Jacob and his team and folks from the Langdon group, Clyde Snow, well, Hanson, Allen, and Luce. So they're all working with us, and they're working feverishly right now. I can't believe Jeff's really here because there's a lot happening at this moment. So he's pulling everything together with all of these existing projects. And we've been talking to a lot of folks, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a second, over the last 6 months about what they'd like to see in this plan. And I think, so once we develop the work plan, the recommendations in that, I'll go over in just a second, but we're going to keep moving with the continued communication and collaboration with folks. And I think that's going to be essential in moving forward and being successful with this basin plan. But we also need to get rolling on the technical components, and that is updating GSLIM models and gathering existing data and new data from our partners and figuring out how to make it all apples and apples and not apples and oranges. And then in 2026, we'll be creating these, running the scenarios and coming up with some solutions that will help us figure out how to ensure that all in the watershed are getting the water that they need. But we know that people want actions today, including our new Great Salt Lake Commissioner. So we will also be providing a list of short-term actions that we could recommend that could help us get to those durable solutions or help us move towards a sustainable water supply. These are the no-brainers, the things that we know that need to be done, the projects, the work that need to be done that are going to get us to where we need to be in the end, which is in 2026. I like to say the very end of 2026 and the early part of 2027, we'll be providing an action plan, which is the communication, education recommendations, potential legal and policy actions, operational infrastructure, organizational actions, economics, and potentially some more monitoring and research recommendations. And like I said, there's no way that we could do a project this scale without a lot of communication, but reaching out to all of these groups and all of the stakeholders in the watershed is a task in and of itself. And this is kind of how we're looking at the groups involved in this Basin Integrated Plan right now. As it stands, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, the newly formed, is kind of over all of this. The Division of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation are organizing the steering committee and the advisory group. And the steering committee is a group of stakeholders in the watershed from, representatives from the Jordan River Commission, from Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District, Central Utah, Friends of Great Salt Lake. Folks of you here in this room, Joe's on there, and Tim, we've appreciated the input so far. We've met, I think, probably about 3 or 4 times now, but we're really seeking their long-term guidance throughout this process and to act as a sounding board, grabbing ideas, bouncing ideas off people. And then the advisory group, also members of you here are in that. That is the state and federal partners that are kind of like the sideboards for what is possible, feasible in terms of recommendations for our action plan. And then as we're gathering all of the data for the project, we want to make sure that it's all digestible and integratable into one central spot. But we also want to make sure that we're communicating with people about all of this data in a central simple fashion. So luckily, each of the basins now have watershed councils. And so we'd like to have the watershed councils for each of the river basins serve as kind of the touch point for the basin plan. So if we have a technical group from the Weaver River watershed, we could go to that watershed council meeting. They could maybe create a subgroup there, and then we could communicate that way. So looking to leverage the expertise of existing groups and then have them give a say or lend an ear in this process. So just really quickly about the work plan, how we've decided to approach these building bubbles that Jeff has made, not blocks, bubbles, not blocks. We started with a situational assessment, and that was done in June, and where we interviewed over 55 people in the Great Salt Lake Basin, and many of you were interviewed in that. And I think the kind of the four takeaways, which I keep forgetting, of the four big picture pieces that I think you guys might find interesting when asked about water management or water planning in the Great Salt Lake Basin, was that people said they felt isolated. So they're like, they could make decisions, but how will their decisions impact other downstream users? If they're motivated to make a change, how do they know that others will make a change? And so just kind of, and also wanting guidance, wanting connection, and not having that, who do I go to? How do I connect with folks? And so it was interesting to, and a little sad to understand that people were feeling this way and wanting to connect and wanting to do more, but just, finding the space to do that is a challenge. The rural and urban divide is obviously an issue. The agricultural and M&I conflict that we see and hear about in the media, with a lot of the pressure on ag. And if we just get rid of these agricultural lands and develop, put townhomes on them, how is that the best use of our water? Shepherding was a big issue. How do we make sure that if we do make these commitments that this water will get to the lake? And then just conflicting uses. So why is, so-and-so's townhome development more important than my alfalfa field? I think my alfalfa field is pretty important. So it was great to get a sense of what people are feeling in the basin. Then we took a look at each of those building bubbles that I showed you and just kind of looked at what the existing, not like a literature review, but just grabbing all of the data that we knew that was out there, or the studies that are underway. This is just for the Great Salt Lake building bubble. Jeff and his crew went out and were identifying all of the funded projects that are going on right now, but then all of the things that could be done in the future. And so this, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of all of the questions and data that has been gathered. You can see, this is Great Salt Lake alone was pretty overwhelming, but this led then to a gap analysis. So for all of these building bubbles, we had, what are the strengths of each of the programs and resources? What do we know? Where are the gaps? And then what are we calling this now, Jeff? Not proposed area of capacity development.
Opportunities.
Opportunities, much more easy to say, but so what can we build on, and what are the opportunities? And so that led to, last week we did a prioritization exercise. So we pulled from the gap analysis over 200 projects and then distilled those down even further to about 40 projects, and then had the steering group and the advisory committee help with the prioritization of some of these. And so what's going to come of that is what's coming out in the work plan in a couple of weeks. And that's a recommendation for the projects that we will be getting underway in addition to the modeling mandate, the water budget modeling stuff that we're mandated to provide. And so speaking of modeling, and I just threw this in yesterday because one of the components of the work plan was to develop this technical approach or the scoping plan for the integrated plan. And what you see here are the short, medium, and long-term modeling, I guess, opportunities or projects that we see. And so Jeff, maybe, well, actually, you said you had salinity, the gap data for the salinity, maybe more specific to Great Salt Lake and then what the Salinity Advisory Committee may find interesting. So maybe if you want to share any of those, and then you can just super briefly talk about these different, the modeling recommendations, and then we'll just wrap up because that's all I have.
All right. Thank you. So yes, the gap analysis was a great exercise, and just, I think we talked over 100 people, just trying to pick people's brains on what has been done, what are they doing now, and what they think needs to be done. And this was all with a focus of trying to understand the water supply and how can we ensure a water supply for the entire watershed, including the lake? Because I think that was an obvious gap is that a lot of our water planning hasn't really considered the amount of water that gets to the lake. It's always been about how can we plan for water up in the watershed. So out of that, that gap analysis that Laura mentioned, one of there's a report. There's actually 6 memos that we're combining into one report now, and it's a long report because there's just so much information. But this is just one row in these tables that pertains to salinity. And as Laura mentioned, we've identified strengths, and certainly this committee's work is one of our key strengths in that arena, and gaps that we have, and then opportunities. And I think some of the key things and there's a lot of things that would be great to do. And of course, what we're trying to do as part of this basic integrated plan is we only have 3 years to do the work, and we only have a certain amount of money and to get answers to critical questions that we can use to be able to make decisions in 2026. So that became our litmus test as to how do we reduce this list of 200 great studies, ideas of things that we would love to do. How do we reduce that into a handful, literally, of studies that we can do in the next couple of years that can really influence the decisions that we make? And so in terms of, with these particular salinity projects, I think some of and a lot of these are things that we've talked about here at the committee, with this committee. But I think one of the important ones that we saw, that graph that Laura flashed on the screen, I think the 3 key metrics in terms of how much water does the lake need. I think, as we talked about it, the 3 key metrics really were salinity, dust emissions, and then being able to support the bird populations. Because those were the 3 metrics that we saw could trigger federal or judicial action, which of course would influence our decision making. So that's really when we boil down this huge list of Great Salt Lake opportunities or studies that we could do, that's what it came down to. And I think the salinity matrix that this committee's developed is a key part of that. And I know one of the recommendations from this committee, and we started doing this about a year ago, was to update that matrix. I think that's still definitely a recommendation, a high priority thing for that should be done. And certainly the range we have is a great working tool, but I think it would be good for this committee, especially as from what Bonnie and Carly been learning about brine flies and what we're learning more about birds. Those are two elements that we didn't really address very well in the matrix, or I should say we could do better. So that, I think the salt mass balance that we're doing here is a very important part that we want to incorporate into the modeling. And then of course, that really what we want to drive to is a long-term salinity management plan. And we don't have time to talk about what could go into that, but I resurrected a file that we started a year ago, where we revisited all the questions that we have and what kind of data do we need, what kinds of studies should we do to be able to make better decisions, actionable decisions on how we can manage salinity. And we certainly talked about a number of them here today. So I think that is really, talking with Ben and Jim, and that's really kind of where we want to make sure we keep our eye on, is we want to get toward the salinity management plan, that can, so that we're not having to be reactive. It would be great if the lake would stay where it's been. Of course, it's been low. So we have new conditions that we're learning on the fly and doing the best that we can to make the best decisions we can. But the idea is to hopefully be able to come up with a management plan. So I think one of the key things that and I guess what I would like to do, I think Laura, I think we talked a little bit about this, is once this is done here in the next week or two, is I'll send these, you'll all get links to all of this information, but there's a lot. But I want to highlight some of these key elements that pertain to the salinity, especially for you all to look at, be able to think about, especially as the work of this committee. I know, and I was looking at this again this morning, I think for mineral extraction, somewhere here, I should just, but I think the study that Mark talked about was certainly, I think, one of the gaps here is, measuring diversions and, return flows. What are the impacts, but also the benefits of mineral extraction? We need to better understand those. And that's exactly what you were talking about this morning. So I think there's definitely opportunities there. And then I think just in terms of the modeling, we have this, we affectionately call it our brine shrimp chart. That, if you remember the chart she showed up there, it has the models in the middle with a kind of a backbone of the database pointing up to this watershed model. At a minimum, we need to have a watershed model that can help us understand how decisions in the watershed can influence the lake. And after reviewing a lot of different options, right now, the way it looks, we're going to update the G-SLIM model.
Stop sharing and then you can go back to the graphic. You did.
Okay. Yes. So what we're looking at doing is updating the G-SLIM model, and doing some more work on the Great Salt Lake module, which is where we have the water and salt balance. So that's, I think, the work that this committee is going to be great to be able to help update that and improve what's in the model. Certainly the work that SOM and USU and many of you are working on the causeway opening, that's important information for the model. That really gives us an understanding of what the overall watershed water budget is and how that influences the lake. And that's really, I kind of see as that's the minimum we have to do. We have to have that to be able to make decisions. But then the other key component of that backbone is really, I think, one of the priorities that really has come up again and again and again this year is that we need to foster connections amongst the watershed with the lake, and then a shared understanding of how we use water and how that influences others, even in the river basin, but also certainly with Great Salt Lake. And so if we just simply develop the G-SLIM model, if the division did that from this building, we would lose the opportunity to really build those connections. And so one of the strategies that we have here is in the middle, is to really, I think that's the middle one, is to, we'll still use the lake and wetland component of GSLIM, but the idea is that we're going to be working with each of the river basins to develop their own model, building upon what they already have, what they use for operations, but really building additional capability in there where they can understand the ramifications of different decisions, so that they can manage their water more effectively. And then that will eventually be linked to GSLIM and become this coupled model that can be used for evaluating and monitoring the water budget, understanding the impacts of different decisions, and hopefully be able to implement new strategies. And then the third one that you see here is really just thinking long term is, every modeler that I know would love to have this beautiful model that just has everything in it. And so we call that a fully coupled model, where we can really fully couple the groundwater models with the surface water models and incorporate all of these great details of our watershed, so that we can click a button and see what happens throughout the whole thing. Well, that's an ideal, and that's going to take a long time to do. But what we want to do as part of this is be thinking about how we can use the data that we're gathering as part of this study, and then what are the next steps, to keep working towards that holy grail of models. But that's kind of this trifecta that we have. That's it.
That's it. Okay. All right. So just wrapping up today, we're working on the work plan. Literally tomorrow, not really tomorrow, but pretty close. We'll have a draft work plan ready for review. And then once the work plan is complete, we're going to start on the actual basin integrated plan, where we'll work on the model, do the studies, work on the solutions and capacity development. And then at the end of 2026, we'll implement those action items. So just as I said, we're wrapping up the work plan right now. We'll have a mid-November release. On November 15th, we have a presentation to the Natural Resources and Agriculture Appropriation Subcommittee. Conveniently, Commissioner Steed also has a presentation right around at that time. And so working with him, kind of pairing the work plan and his new strategic plan together, I think is wonderful timing. We'll present that to the legislature, and that will kind of mark the kickoff for the public review process for the work plan. And then we'll have looking like a virtual open house, but an open house in early December, December 7th, I believe it will be the exact date, with a 45-day review period. So you can all take a look at it. And then contracting will get underway in the beginning of January to start on the planning efforts. That's all I have.
Great. Any questions on that? So there's much to come there.
Oh, and if I can just move this thing, we do have a project website, and so you can always, in water resources, just Google Great Salt Lake Basin Planning, and this should come up, but we'll have the website. It will have links to the documents. We'll make sure, though, that it gets out to you guys, have Ben or Marissa or Jeff share it all out. But anyway, you can always check the website or email me with questions. Or if you have someone who's interested in learning more about the integrated plan, I can come chat with any groups you think would be helpful. That's all I have to say.
All right. I think unless anybody has anything else, I think we can adjourn. Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
Oh. Thanks.